Welcome, everybody, to the Confluence podcast. I'm Randall Stephens, and I've got a special guest today, Reg Prentice, with us from TonicDM. So welcome, Reg.
Thank you.
Yes. I was trying to think back of when we originally met. I'm pretty sure we were introduced by somebody at Gensler, because I know you used to work there, if I'm not mistaken. And it was probably either Mr. Kincannon or can't remember who introduced us.
Plummer.
Robert Plummer may have introduced us.
Yeah. So, I remember meeting you at the Avail AU party, suite party.
Yeah. So this probably goes back to the earliest days of Avail is probably when we got introduced. So it's probably been 7 or 8 years ago that we've known each other. But thanks for coming on. I get to see you, at a lot of these industry events, and we always get to compare notes about what's going on. You actually participated in our first regional Confluence event that we did in Southern California last year. So thanks for that. And we're always interested in getting out, talking AEC tech. So glad you were willing to come on and share. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of your background, how you got into building technology in the AEC industry, and then we can start talking about TonicDM.
Yeah, I went to architecture school. And even at architecture school, I was kind of the guy in the computer room helping the other students with AutoCAD. And after school, I moved to LA and started working with Frank Gehry. I was always in the tech side of it. So even when I started there, it was more with a view to me being the CAD manager than it was with a view to me being a production architect. So I started writing Lisp routines and things and took over as CAD manager from one of the architects who didn't want to do their job anymore. Back in the 90s, it was kind of architects who got roped into it, sometimes against their will. So she was happy to have me come in and take over that role so that she could go back. Actually worked on Disney Concert Hall. Was a key person in that project. And so that was my introduction to kind of tech and coding a bit, like amateur coding. So I ended up writing like a whole suite of Lisp routines for AutoCAD 12. And then I also got into web development once that came along. And I was looking back through my notes, Randall, and I actually built a kind of a TonicDM-like app when I was at Frank's office. So I looked up some screenshots. So it was called iShare. So this actually is from 2006. These are screenshots I took of the kind of final version of it.
That's awesome.
So yeah, you could log in as a guest to download stuff or as a Gehry employee, and then you could set up a team if you were one of the Gehry people, and then it had a Java plugin that would upload the files. And as I was looking through this, I was like, man, there was things that I could do with this that we don't even do now. Because, Java had a lot of access to the machine. Yeah. So you could do folder uploading, folder downloading, and you could do a lot of things that are much harder to do now because of browser security.
Yeah.
So,
it's interesting that, even with our work that we've done here with Avail, we opted to build a desktop application mainly because there is a lot of challenges if you're trying to interact with something in a browser and something on your computer. And by definition, you want those two worlds to not talk to each other or have access to each other.
Right.
So it gets interesting, right, in this whole dilemma about, web-based apps and all the good things about that, but there's still something to be said to having access to that local machine, but it's a huge security challenge.
Yeah. And so for good reason, Java on the desktop kind of went away. So this was like an early example I was thinking of where I was creating a web app. It was a pretty simple use case, basically just moving around large sets of files and folders. and really trying to keep it as simple as possible. This was all coded by me in Notepad using ASP over the course of a few years, adding features to it. And so I really enjoyed working on this project. And I think it was good. It served a need, right? And, it was an opportunity to work with the architects and look at how they were using it, what they wanted to do with it. And we kind of solved quite a few problems together about, how third parties should upload, what rights they should have to upload. Should they be able to upload and distribute to other third parties without, Gehry's office being involved? Because, if you have two people on the East Coast and they're using it as their file sharing, for the project, they don't want to have to wait for the West Coast to come in and, reshare something that they've uploaded. So it was a good experience. And it was the tool of choice for Gehry for maybe, I think, about 10 years, like a 10-year run.
How much of those, there was obviously that early problem of not wanting to attach, needing to transfer files, between people and not wanting to attach those to emails, which the file, that was always a big challenge. So I would assume that a lot of this that you were working on was driven by trying to keep this stuff out of the email. But what I was going to ask was how much that same problem set is here, just, not 25 meg files. It's now 250 megabyte files. And
right. Yeah. I think that the fundamental needs behind it haven't changed at all. One of the things is just simple and quick. One problem that we were responding to is that each project that went into production would get a project management website, like Buzzsaw, let's say, or Bluebeam. Blue Line Online was one back then. But that often wouldn't happen for 6 months or 9 months sometimes, because there was a whole process of choosing one, like which one is going to be used. And I'm sure today, a lot of times it's the contractor that hosts the site, but often the contractor isn't chosen until, DD or even into CDs. Maybe, sometimes even, they have to bid, and it's post-bid that you even have a contractor. So the office had a need, like on day one, we have to start sharing. Like there's no signed contract. All we know is there's a possible project, but we need to start sharing files. So this was a way that, with a couple of minutes, we could just add another project and away they go. And then there is a central place for those files to live. And there's also a tool that people can use to share large files. So this particular tool was really just it was called an extranet at the time, and it was just sharing large files.
Right.
I think there was a team list element, like you could see people's names and email addresses, but that need hasn't changed. Right? You could have a proposal stage project, and you need to start sharing files, and it needs to be low admin and easy for the staff to find and do. So that hasn't changed.
So how much of this, the early work that you were doing there at Gehry with this, how much is that still kind of at the core of the theme? You kind of have this lifelong thematic,
right?
It's like a lifetime of work. Once you start thinking about it in some way, it's hard to stop.
Because I can remember, Frank Gehry's office was the first full-time job I had.
Yeah.
And I was thinking back, I can remember being in Jim Glimp's office. He was one of the partners with Dennis Sheldon. And Jim was drawing diagrams of the owner and the contractor and the design firms and the design consultants and the fabricators and how they share information. And, being pretty fresh out of architecture school, that was pretty much new to me, right? And so I was looking back thinking, Jim kind of trained me on this stuff. And I was really interested in it from a data structure point of view, kind of a systems thinking point of view about how the different parties interact and what their different needs are, and how the needs of each party are quite different, and what they want to get out of a system is quite different. And that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. There's, different information exchanges have different levels of kind of importance from the contractual point of view. So some it's fine just to flip some files back and forwards or share them in real time, but other ones, no, you better have a good copy of that one because that one's an important one, right? And so making this iShare tool kind of grew out of that a bit. There wasn't a construction administration component of it. But I was also the person in the office who was reviewing the different choices for project management websites for different teams, helping lead them through the process of which one should be used. Pretty quickly, it was clear that the contractor had the most at stake. They have the most complex workflows. Often they're managing the finances of the project through it. So even though in some respects, the architect has control, like often in the spec division 1, it'll say, that you have to use whatever the architect chooses. But in reality, it's not going to happen. And it's not even a very good choice because the contractor using someone else's system is just not going to be a good idea.
Right.
But the design firms still have needs, right? And so it was really that time at Frank's office, working with Jim Glimpf and Randy Jefferson and Dennis, that I kind of got schooled in all of this and did some experiments, made some tools myself. I later went on to spend about 9 years at Gensler. And at Gensler, I wasn't building anything. Gensler, my role wasn't to start building extranets for them. They had different people doing that. But at Gensler, I did spend a lot of time with the architects kind of studying design process. And it was very interesting, I have to say. Gensler has a research division. They have some books on Amazon, which are quite good if you can buy their research books. And that was very interesting from just what is design, how do design firms produce value, like what's the value they provide to their client, and the study of that is really what led to me starting Tonic, and that I could see a practical need for tools to manage information, but there's also a bigger picture about what is the role of design firms when it comes to information generation and value generation in the construction industry. So,
yeah. So maybe we can use that as the kind of transition to, what is TonicDM? What was the original, problem that you kind of set out, thought that you could solve with it, and then, ultimately how's it evolved?
Yeah. So even, I always thought, being in the kind of design technology world, that a solution would be imminent, right? It was like, should I create this iShare product for Gehry's back in, the late 90s, early 2000s? I was like, no, it'd be a waste of time because,
somebody will do it.
Within 6 months or a year, there's got to be a product for this, right? And I would say today, other than Tonic, there really isn't, because for a product like this to be effective, it has to be simple, automated, and larger firms have IT resources, but typically they're not focused on this kind of thing. So something has to just be, trivial to spin up. So it got to the point when I was at Gensler that I was just like, nobody is building this, right? It just doesn't exist in the market. So I decided to give it a go, I was an enterprising chap. So
if you knew better, if for those of us that do this for a living, it's like, man, if you knew before you started how hard it was going to be, maybe you wouldn't have ever started. But that's the life of an entrepreneur.
I think in the entrepreneurial journey, there was a time when I was very concerned that it would fail, right? That I would build something, people wouldn't like it, it would not get traction. And then I got to the point where I was just like, no, I don't really care about that anymore. It's like, obviously I want it to succeed, but if it doesn't, I'll get another job, right?
That's a good,
and
good attitude.
and
It's a healthy attitude, I think.
yeah, and I think for most businesses fail, right?
Sure.
It's common, so one has to be prepared for that. And it wasn't until I kind of thought to myself, I want to try it, even if I try and fail. I still want to know that I've tried. So the initial concept was it wasn't based on iShare specifically, but it was the same value proposition. Like it has to be ready day one. Very trivial to spin up a project, to get the thing running. You have to be able to share super easily, no friction. Initially, Tonic didn't do email filing. And that was because I didn't want to create modules that were just the same thing as was already available. And there are simple email filing tools available. Like, that's not new. So we didn't create email filing, thinking people can just use existing tools for that. We created some RFI and submittal tools and the file sharing tools and team management. And it was all cloud-based. It was trivial to sign up, create an account, start putting in projects. I was looking back at the timeline because, one forgets. So it was actually mid-2015 that coding started on it. And in September 2016, we had our first user.
Okay. You're about the same lineage as our work on the Avail. We probably started or sometime early 2015 writing code, spent a year, and then kind of had something that we could put in people's hands, and then spent another year of kind of beta. So kind of our process too. Yeah. I was going to ask before I lose this, like with this idea that you didn't want to reinvent things that were kind of already out there. I talk about this all the time. It's like, if something is already out there, I don't want to respend the engineering efforts to reproduce that. I'd rather either support it or point you towards that. How much do you have to fight that? And then when do you decide to give, and when do you hold your line when customers are asking you to do this? If you could point to another solution that's out there, how do you, just as a developer and kind of product owner, how do you make those decisions?
So we do get that a lot, particularly with field tools, because Tonic doesn't have modules for capturing images in the field and putting together field reports or doing punch list reports. And so far, we've pointed customers to other tools, like layer.team is one. And we've, I guess, explained that, for those companies, the field work is their whole worldview. That's what they specialize in. And if Tonic made one, it would be second best to that, because we're not specialists in field. It's possible we would create a tool like that at some point in the future. Yeah. But at the moment, we have to get what we're doing to be, as close to perfect as we can. We don't want to split that development. So we do have some prospective customers who that's a problem for them. But most customers, I think, understand, that not every tool does everything, and you have to draw the boundaries.
Yeah, I think it's I call it our swim lane, and defining that swim lane, as a company and product is there's a lot of gray there, right? Because you can venture over into a little bit in this area, but then it's like my fear is always, if you do a little bit, they're going to want more, and all of a sudden you may be drugged, completely in a direction that doesn't make sense.
That's natural, right?
Yeah.
Of course, that's going to happen. I'm also very concerned about creating a half-built tool that just stays half-built, which is is a relative of what you were talking about, where you just get pulled into more and more features. Like, it's possible that we create a tool, we get it to a usable point, but then we're not committed enough to keeping it evolving. And so it becomes a kind of backwater of the software.
Yep. But it's still code that has to be supported and
and maintained and trained on.
It's a big challenge when you're developing like this. That I always talk about it with our team that like as soon as we add that, there's going to be one person who thinks that it's like live or die that has to be there, and nobody else cares. And those become the real challenges over time of maintaining. It's just complexity in your product and
and complexity ultimately kills the product.
Yep.
Right. So it's easy to get dragged into that road.
Yeah. You made the comment earlier, and I was probably smiling because actually during our Confluence event last year, or maybe it was year before last, I made a comment that was just because you can doesn't mean you should. And you said that earlier, and it kind of became a little bit of a mantra during that Confluence sessions that, it's true. And I made the comment in that I see it inside of firms where, there's always problems and you're always looking to solve that problem. And sometimes it's like, trying to put out that fire like quickly by either developing something internally or going and buying just even another product to kind of attack it. But over time, what you end up with are like, 100 or 200 different things that are now in place. And you get this fragility from that. And it's like, my perspective was always like, maybe sometimes you're creating more problems longer term within the firm. I even try to go put that fire out in some immediate kind of quick fashion, as opposed to kind of,
we spend a lot of time removing things from the product. And our goal is to be able to achieve the same outcome and have the same feature, but with less buttons. So one of the things that I enjoy most is figuring out how to remove a button while still keeping the same feature.
I'm with you. We've had a couple of cycles where we'll do a bunch of work, months, 6 months to a year worth of work on a new, set of features. And my testament is always like, if the product actually feels like it got simpler, but I know we just did a bunch of work, then that's usually like testament. I think it's exactly what you're saying, which is simpler is better, and taking things away is hard, really hard.
Yeah. Taking away a feature is hard.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I often think that Tonic sells the lack of features, right? Like our goal is to have as few buttons as possible, while obviously still, producing the result.
Yeah, I think, it's easy to point at Apple and what they did, but, it's like the success of these devices, right? The iPad and the iPhone, obviously, to me, it's like they were religiously trying to take things away and make it very simple, which, I think it's a form of democratizing this for more people to make it usable for more people, because, we're not, we're not all wired the same way. And,
one of the things that I observed in design technology and practice was that complex software is used by very few people to its full extent, or even to half of its extent.
Sure.
And so a company will often buy licenses for everyone in the firm, but it's possible that 2 or 3 people actually get that value, and maybe 100 people are not using it, or they're using it badly, which is sometimes even worse because they'll make mistakes and, let's say release things that shouldn't have been released, but they just did it because they didn't understand how the software worked. So I think, our mantra has been simplicity has value, that the way for companies to get value from their software purchases is actually through the simplicity of the software, because you call it democratizing it. So when we're looking at the software, we're constantly thinking, how would the average person look at this? Like a person who doesn't give 2 hoots about a computer, right? They're not into computers. They don't care about the computer. Like, how are they going to be a user of it? because we know that there are 2 or 3 people in each firm who will brute force their way into understanding any software just out of, force of will. But that doesn't give value to a firm, right? It only has value when the average person is a competent user of the software.
No, completely agree. And I think it mirrors a lot of our thinking as we've developed. Do you develop, though, advanced features that are available? Like, do you think about in your development that there's kind of, everybody starts with the basic, but if they want to go deeper, they can kind of get deeper? How do you all think about that?
Yep. I think there's always an element of that. So an example might be when you're sharing files. This was actually a user request. It used to just say upload.
Yep.
And they were like, but where are my files? Like, and actually just said send files, right? And they were like, but what am I going to send, right? So naming of buttons so that the names have to be short, but they have to kind of really, like, much more than I would have first thought. They have to explain what they're going to do. So, but if you take one that you've already sent, in the sidebar here, you can add more recipients, right? So it's next to the recipient list, and there's a toggle for add more recipients. And if you click that, you can search for people and then send to these recipients. So I think that's an example of what you were mentioning, and that the key is to put the feature in the place where someone might be looking for it, make it descriptive, and then make it just very simple, right? So you add the people you send to these recipients, you can BCC yourself. And what happens in the background is pretty complex. And this is something I think you've talked about too, Randall, is, the simpler it appears to the user, it's inversely proportional to how much work it was to actually make that feature.
The back end is usually inversely proportional to the simplicity.
Yeah. So when you do send this, it actually creates a second transmittal, so that the fact that one person got it on one day and the other person didn't get it until a second day is actually recorded, for the record. And it actually reactivated the link itself, added another month to the link. So I think you're right. You have to have advanced features because the world is complicated, right? Yep. But they have to be presented in a way that doesn't appear like it's an advanced feature.
Yeah, I think one thing that, just taking the example that you're showing is, I've seen software where the complexity gets put on the front end, and it's like a bunch of decisions are being made as opposed to what's the simplest form of this, and then as a second or third step, give the option of kind of getting more complexity.
Right.
I think I would agree, and it looks like that's the way that you all have kind of developed this. But I've seen some software. We all know complicated software that we've had in our life, and it's like the more options sometimes that are on the front end, I think it does create one. It makes it very hard to learn, and then can be very using, I think, on the front end for users to kind of understand what the intent.
I think another trick in that respect is, instead of creating project options, we just wait for the person to do it the first time, and then we remember that.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no explicit option. It's just taking a cue from what the user did and just saving that behind the scenes.
Yep.
So Tonic has very few options. I personally am hugely resistant to anything which requires, as you said, pre-setup and pre-configuration, because people just, one, they don't do it.
Yep.
They'll just use it without pre-configuring it. And often you don't need to pre-configure it, because you can just ask the question at the time that it's first used, and then just remember.
It, right? So you'll build do you end up building a profile per user then that's kind of customizing those workflows?
Per user, per project, per firm, right? There are obviously some settings. Like, for example, each firm has their own submittal stamp. And as much as I would like to standardize submittal stamps across the industry, we're not in that position.
Right.
So we have to allow each firm to type in the choices. And when we're working with the customer to put in the choices, I can just go like, I can say to myself, right, these are stupid choices, right? Like these two are the same. These ones are meaningless, but that's totally outside Tonic's control. Like that's their legal team has come up with that. So those things, sure, we make an option. But if it's just kind of a usage of the software thing, it doesn't need to be pre-established, right? You don't need to make someone go through a setup routine.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think about those. Those are those kind of religious wars that you're not going to fight, right? It's like, okay, if that's the way you're going to do it, I'll just support it and keep going. But pick a different fight.
Yeah. We do often get users. I mean, we encourage, like we live off user feedback, right?
Sure.
And I would say I can't think of anything a user has said which has just been like, no, that's a dumb idea. Like when the users give feedback, it's always like, wow, you're right. Yep. We can't always execute on it right away. And unfortunately, there's some things that we're like, that's an awesome idea. It's super important, but it did take us years to get there just because of the way things happen. But it's always insightful. And I would say users do often ask for options and they ask for features, but through discussing it with them, we try to understand, like, how could you do that without another, in quotes, feature, so that it just happens, right? And that's what we try to get to.
We get very similar, obviously, lots of feedback and comments and requests that come through, and our process that we try to go through is to always think about it as it takes a level of interpretation. So you have to take what people have asked you. They can only ask you
right
based on their knowledge and understanding, which may not be about technology, and it may be a direct response to something that's already in the software. And it's like our job really should be to take that, try to empathize with what they're trying. And a lot of times, as you said, that takes going back and, the best customers are the ones that are willing to jump on a call and when you ask and say, hey, would you explain this a little bit more? What's the problem?
Right.
Even your example there earlier that you showed of the being more explicit about the verbiage on the buttons, or on those tabs, that's a challenge because you can imagine wanting to be like, I want that to be very simple and I don't want that to be this long anymore. But that's a great example because we have those same kinds of challenges. It's like things that we would think are just like completely obvious is like, no, maybe difference in nomenclature. And
when I'm doing feature mockups, I usually start with a lot of text, like a lot of things written out very explicitly. And then Deb, who's my co-founder, like I'll run her through it and she's just like, it's way too much.
Right.
So it's usually initially a back and forth with Deb where we just try to trim and trim and trim down to something which is visually simple, right? And then go to users as well, show them, we do as much as possible. We'll just bring up Figma and just go through things with users and get their feedback, just trying to understand how different people will look at it and what they will see, when a screen comes up.
Yeah, we do the same. We've got a feature that we're developing about to release right now. And, this one is allowing you to create PDFs from, content that's, images, putting images like on a canvas. And so anyway, the internally, this is going on right now, but there's been this little internal name. And sometimes you try to be kind of clever, like you're trying to come up with a cool name for this thing. And, my feedback the other day with Eric on our team was like, why don't we just call it PDF export? Like exactly what it is. Like, and that's it's a good example because its primary use case is going to be to create PDFs, but we've also creating the export of like JPEG or PNG. There's other choices. So now the question is like, do you try to step all the way back, or are you making this way more complicated than it needs to be? Just call it PDF export, but if you want to do a JPEG or PNG, it's in there too, right? Like,
Yeah. We just call it export.
Yeah, export. But these are the kinds of things, I think, from a dev standpoint that, it's what we try to do on this podcast. We're trying to get people that are building these tools to come on and talk about, this is the behind the scenes. This is the kinds of stuff that we have to think about and the way the sausage is actually.
And naming is so hard. And naming a company is the hardest.
Yeah. So give us that. What's the backstory?
Well, I used to kind of laugh at people's company names. And now I'm just like, man, like it's
hard.
Like, yeah, I can just imagine them trying to think of a company name. So Tonic, we went through several names. One, we came up with Copper, which I thought was a great name because it's like a high quality material. It has a patina.
Ages well.
Kind of architectural.
Looks better over time.
Exactly. and then I found that in Melbourne, there's already a Copper project management system. It's for the film industry.
Okay.
It's not for AEC, but I was just like, man, too close, right? Too close. So Tonic ended up just being like, well, we got to call it something. And it sounds kind of refreshing. Tonic, right?
Who doesn't like a good gin and tonic?
Yep. It's the same word in all languages. So anywhere in the world, it's going to mean the same thing, which is always a problem with words that have different meanings in different cultures. And then the DM is just, well, you can't buy tonic.com, right?
Right.
And so you just have to add some letters to it. So
should have been RP. Why wasn't it RP? Tonic RP.
DM was for document management, right? So, and again, it's like, I'm not sure anyone really knows that, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. I think the biggest downside of the word tonic is that sometimes people mistakenly call it toxic. But, I don't know. Maybe that's a cool name.
No,
too.
I kind of, there's not that many times in my career that I can remember epiphany little moment, like a moment. It's usually a made up story in hindsight that it happened kind of in a moment.
Okay.
But when we were working on what became Avail, I do remember the day that I was like, I ran around the corner to the team and I'm like, we're going to call this thing Avail. I can remember that day. I was like, it just came to me. I'm like, this is what it's going to be called.
Yep.
It wasn't, it's like for us, it was like most people think it's like the word available, but to avail yourself, right, is a word on its own. And, that was really the kind of intent around it. So it just kind of was one of those, it's like, this is what we're trying to do. Avail all this information to you. So anyway.
Yep. So I can show you a Figma if you want.
Yeah, I would love to see.
Let's see if I can.
Yeah, it sounds like you're using, we're probably all using some of the same kinds of tools today, right? Figma's a great one for laying these things out. We do walkthroughs as well, and that it allows us to mock this stuff up and go talk to customers well before we've written code. So.
Yeah. So Figma for me is a great way to think through systems. So the way that Figmas are built is as components. So you drill down into UI components, but the way that it is componentized in Figma is also instructive to how the team will build it and how a user will use it. So this is actually our new Outlook sidebar. It's already being built. This part of it is already built, but it's built on a new platform for us. So it's kind of a ground up rebuild of our existing stuff. But I like Figma because it's very visual, obviously, and you just lay out all the screens next to each other. You can move around and work on things. The way that Figma componentizes is super helpful, and the way that components get reused. So I usually do a lot of work here every day, particularly talking with customers and then immediately jumping into Figma and trying out a few things and seeing how it would look.
Do you all, create like a story? Is there a problem statement? Like how much do you do that before you start kind of laying this out?
I think we have several parallel tracks, I would say. So we use Jira and Confluence from Atlassian. So our library, I'd call it a library of Confluence and Jira materials, has grown over 8 years. Originally, I used just Google Docs and had a template that I would use to fill things in. Again, the earlier in the process, I would say we wrote up detailed specs a lot more because we were building from scratch. Now we have this library of content. So most of the features are really, it's just building on something that's already there.
Mm-hmm.
I actually find that very few people will read somebody else's notes. And I found that in when I was in practice as well. Like I would write up a lot of documentation, the CAD manual, all of that stuff, but no one ever reads it, right? I'm really writing it for myself.
Yeah, I was going to say it's kind of cathartic though, just even clear your own head and to get it on paper.
Right. And to understand what you're going to tell someone to make sure that you have it right. So Figma and Confluence for me are really just me making sure that I know what I'm going to tell someone.
Yep.
But most of the time, we have a stand-up meeting every day, and then we have meetings as needed. So most of it is just conversational. So I'll explain to someone and show them, walk them through what they need to build, and then there's a level of understanding, and then they build it. And often it's a little bit different, but often it's also better than what I had originally thought was going to be built.
Sure.
But I would say it's only semi-formal at best.
What does the team look like, Reg, that's actually building the product?
So there are 15 people at Tonic now, and there are 8 engineers. So I don't know if it's for me, it's kind of important that more than half the company is an engineer are actually engineers who build products.
A good mix.
I'd like it to be, as we get bigger, maybe 80% of the company are software engineers building the product.
It's usually though, kind of the opposite, right? As the org grows or the product is, more popular, I think the probably norm is like 25% ends up kind of dev, as opposed to half.
Right.
But, I think when our kind of sizes, right, we're about the same size as what you're describing. And I think it is, you're usually about half and half, right? You got half the house that's selling and maintaining and the other half is building. So.
Yeah. I would like to think that as Tonic grows, the number of software engineers or the percent of software engineers also grows rather than shrinks. Because my understanding is that at the very large firms, it might be 10% is engineering. Like the sales and marketing departments are huge.
Its own beast.
And I'd like to think that could be avoided. We are able to achieve the level that we do just through several forms of efficiency. So one is backend, overhead systems like accounting and HR and stuff are just practically automated, right? Which is possible now in the digital age. You can outsource and automate just so much of the overhead stuff. And, if you build a great product that has word of mouth, that's the best marketing you can have, right? So we actually just hired our first marketing person, which is awesome. But it's interesting to think we've got to 8 years in without marketing. And, one salesperson. And so again, if we keep sales simple and Chris, who's our salesperson, works autonomously, right? Like he doesn't need sign off to do anything, which I think at maybe more established companies, you end up with sales organizations where the salespeople are battling their own organization as much as they are trying to make sales. But if you streamline all that, I think, so far at least, we've been able to minimize expenditure in overhead and just focus everything on software development. And that's our goal as we move forward, is to keep that culture.
Yeah, I agree. The more resources you can keep towards what the customer is going to end up seeing and using every day, the better. And
I think it's more fun. It's like, hopefully working at Tonic is fun. And all of that fun comes from the fact that people are empowered. Like software engineers, as I was saying, I kind of explain to them what we need and show them, and we talk about it, right? But they go off and they do it. And that's possible because we've hired people who work independently and are smart, right? And so we don't have to oversee them in a traditional kind of hierarchical sense.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment too about the sales and keeping your sales simple. I think that's probably a testament or a reflection of, you're not making up a new price for there's not a new negotiation. It's like a lot of transparency in things that used to be, kind of this more complicated process.
Right.
I think there's been just a big movement over the last, 10, 15 years for make this simple. Subscription models have made that somewhat simpler, right? It's like, so it's just not even as complicated on the front end on the sales, which I think then reduces your need for that infrastructure.
Yeah. We don't have discounts. We only have 2 products. It's super simple. And Chris, I don't need to monitor Chris. Like he does everything to do with sales, and it's fine with me. Yeah.
What's kind of on the plate? What's new that you guys are working on that people can look forward to?
A lot of what we're doing is on the platform level. We want to be able to offer data residency, particularly, while still maintaining like a single Tonic system, which is a complex backend and kind of data structure undertaking. So we're working on that so that customers will be able to choose the country that their company data and separately each project data is hosted in. Our Canadian customers, so far they've been generous with us. Like, it'd be better if it was hosted in Canada. And the same with UK and Australia customers. So we want to be able to offer that to them. So that's an example of just platform development.
What do you all build on Azure, AWS, or Google, or where are you?
It's actually 100% AWS. And we're really doubling down on AWS because, again, if you simplify and say, we're just going to use AWS for everything, you can radically simplify it's called DevOps, the management of the back end of the platform.
We've done the same.
So
we've done this.
Yeah. So we have really efficient deploying. So we can deploy and pull back deployments, just with buttons. Infrastructure as code is something that we're now getting pretty good at. Some of our engineers have cracked that one. Yep. So we can spin up services, take down services through scripts, basically. Or in AWS, you can run it as buttons. And it's a security and platform maturity play as well, in that you want the platform to be managed through code so that everything is automatically audited, so that we develop in one AWS account and production is another, so that only very few people have access to the production account. But with infrastructure as code, it's easy to practice in different AWS accounts, run simulations, and then finally you deploy it into the production account. Also on that platform side, single tenanting is something that we'll have probably in the not too distant future. And again, the same infrastructure as code, so that you can spin up AWS accounts for individual customers. So that's kind of a lot of platform work, which is, the customer sees very little of that. Maybe there becomes a brochure or bullet point. Oh, we can now host your data in different countries, right?
It seems like,
which looks simple, right?
It seems like these, I'll just say either requirements or what's interesting to people, comes in waves. We can kind of see it like seems like about every 6 months, there's something different. We were joking about it the other day. It's like things will ripple through and all of a sudden that's all you hear, or you hear it several times for 6 months and then it goes away. Like the data, actually just security as a whole, was right before the pandemic or right around that time, it seemed like we were getting all of these, like we would get RFPs and some, 100-page technical document that they were wanting us to, and then they just kind of went away. It's like, okay. So I'm not sure what was causing that, but it seems like a lot of these kind of themes come and go, right? I don't know if you have the same experience or not.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the trick as the product manager is to know which ones have true importance and which ones are fads.
Yeah.
I think for me, perhaps growing up outside of the US is useful in the sense that I hope I'm attuned to the kind of cultural differences that particularly the colonies, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, kind of, and how people do really value some things differently. And data residency, is actually important for them, right? So sometimes you'll get away with it, like some companies that maybe are closer to the US in terms of their culture. But for a lot of companies, it's a non-starter, if you can't host in their geo. So that's something that we've thought about from the very beginning of Tonic. It's taken this long to get to the maturity stage where we can start to offer it, though.
How many regions do you support in AWS?
Well, currently it's all just US East 1. So that's the goal of the new platform rebuild, is that it'll be designed to be able to host in any AWS region. But just running the basic infrastructure is quite expensive in a region. So it's not like we'll just spin up in all regions simultaneously. It'll be based on customer requests.
Yeah, we host in US East, and we also have servers in Sydney. And, between those kind of, the Sydney will serve really just Australia and New Zealand for us. What we'll do is when we have a customer anywhere in the world, some of the first stuff we try to do is just to make sure that, the latency of talking to either the USD servers or those Sydney servers, we just kind of measure that. And then, there's probably a need coming up soon for us to maybe drop some in Europe, just to get a little closer. But for the most part, the internet speeds are enough, and the latency is low enough for what we've been doing that hadn't been a huge problem.
Yeah. Another thing we're putting quite a bit of work into is data import when a customer first comes on board.
Yeah.
Again, that's something that it's not part of the core product. Like an existing customer doesn't value that, but we have put an enormous amount of effort into it, years of development, which is ongoing. And that's because for new customers, it's critical, right, to be able to bring all their data with them. So we have super high fidelity import of data. So a customer spinning up, it's pretty much seamless now.
What kind of systems is that data coming out of, Reg?
So that's primarily Newfoundland.
Okay.
We also have many customers that come from public folders.
Yep.
And some from no system at all. So they still have data they need to import. Sure. So we have a variety of tools that we use in different circumstances that will rebuild that data in Tonic, including all its linked emails, notes, all of that comes across settings. So that's been a 4-year effort or something. Yeah. We're still going on it, but it's just because, it's par for the course, right? You got to be able to do that if you want to win a customer. So on the user facing side, we're expanding our CA tools. So we now have the first version of change orders. Again, it was something where we created what I would call a complete change order system that would work for different AEC users with a high level of functionality. But it turns out most of the customers actually only use part of it. So we're initially launching a kind of change order light, which is really simple and also very powerful. It's based on spreadsheets that customers gave us of how they do it now, right? And so we looked at, okay, what are they doing in the spreadsheet and how do we make it as close to that as possible?
Is that where they were actually doing that work or tracking it was in a spreadsheet typically?
Yeah. And so we were able to come up with something which I think is going to be very fast to use because it's simple, right? And that's what people value. And then we have the full backend running. We're just not going to expose it initially. We actually have quite a lot of Tonic like that you only get access if you ask for it.
Yeah.
And it's not like people pay. It's just that we don't turn it on unless you ask for it because it keeps everything simpler if you don't need it. So I think we'll then look at how to start to work with other customers that want the more sophisticated change order functionality and start to refine that so that you can operate at different levels of complexity, let's say, depending on what you need, and that the UI will scale appropriately.
That makes sense. You bring up a point that I'm not clear about, or just because I'm not as intimate with your platform, but when you buy Tonic, are you buying access to everything, or do you all break it up into modules and you can decide which modules you want to and pay different? How have you thought about going about that?
Yeah. And just like with company names, every company goes through a million different ways to sell the products. Right. What we've come to is that there are just two levels, what we call standard and standard plus CA. So if a company doesn't use the CA tools at all, then they would typically just buy enterprise standard. So they would buy a license of standard for each person that uses email, which is typically everybody. Then for companies that want to use CA, those users will pay the higher price for standard plus CA. So if you had 100 people, you could have 100 standard, or you might have 80 standard and 20 standard plus CA. So you're only paying for the CA upgrade for the people who you think will use it. But we don't actually limit it. Every company gets unlimited access. The billing or the sales part of it is just a negotiation between two businesses.
Sure.
In the 80s, people pirated software.
Right,
and
right.
So the software companies didn't know who was using their software. But now with cloud tools, it's like, we know what they're doing, right? Sure. So we want them to think that they're getting great value, right? And we want us to think like we're getting properly remunerated for providing the software. Yep. And as long as both those things are true, then we're happy.
Yep. I'll call it being gracious. I want our licensing to be gracious, and don't, the other way to think about it is I don't want friction. I don't want attack, whatever word you want to use on you using the product. I want you to get value out of it, and then we'll just agree from a business standpoint. If you got value, you're going to pay us for it. So.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's an admin thing as well. Like Tonic is practically zero admin.
Yeah.
Right. And part of that is you don't have to name users or turn people on or off or worry about people not getting access to the tool they need at the time they need it. It's a huge time saver. And again, simplicity, right? It simplifies administration. It simplifies our life. We don't have to chase after people.
Sure.
We don't have to cut license keys or anything like that, which helps us keep our team small, right? And
focused on product, not licensing and, digital rights management of that, right? So it's, well, good. Well, Reg, I know Evan, couldn't be on here today with us, but I know he was looking forward to it, but, glad that you could join me. Thanks for being able to share, some of the glimpse into what the back-end process looks like. It's always interesting to see and hear, and what we hope is those that are watching, that are tuning into the podcast are finding it interesting too. It's kind of like the peek behind the curtain of how all this is done. So I appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate it, Randall and Evan and Absentia.
Yes.
And I think it's great to share this stuff because there's so much room for innovation and opportunity. And we're seeing that. Like, I can't believe how many companies there are now producing stuff. And, the more the merrier. It's a part of society and technology that needs as much innovation as we can drive.
Sure. Yeah. And I was also going to say thanks. Last year when you came to the regional Confluence event and presented there, that's part of this too, is that we're trying to have these, we're doing, I don't know when this episode will end up it'll probably be post our New York, but we're doing an event next week in New York City around AI and machine learning and, bringing the practitioners and the people building these tools into the same room. We like to promote everything that we're doing with Confluence is, nobody's trying to sell anybody anything. We're just trying to understand what's going on, what we should be thinking about. And it really does take, it takes this sharing and being able to have these open conversations to, I think, progress the industry and learn. So I really appreciate your coming on and also participating in our live Confluence events that we've had as well.
Well, thanks, Randall.
All right.